Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series of Wealthy Conversations. We're going to give people just a minute to join, and then we're going to kick off. Okay, I think we're going to get started. It is my pleasure to be here with Jordan Ray Kelly, who is the head of cybersecurity for the Americas at FTI Consulting. Jordan has an amazing background that I'm going to ask her to touch on. And this webcast could not be more timely. We're really interested, Jordan, to be able to hear what you have to say, your perspective, and to be able to get some guidance. You did another webcast for us, which was just phenomenal to be able to think through all the stuff that's happening and changing in the world. So before we jump in, I would love for you to kind of go through your amazing credentials. You White House, FBI, you know what you're talking about. If you can kind of just quickly touch on that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks everyone for logging on. I hope we have time to open it up to your questions as well. But we're here to talk about one of my favorite topics in the world, which is cybersecurity. I joined FTI Consulting about 3.5 years ago, and now I serve as the head of our cybersecurity team here in the Americas, as Megan said. But prior to that, I spent about a dozen years with the FBI, where I did all things in the cybersecurity space. Strategy, legislation, public affairs, but also investigating incidents and understanding how they were affecting the United States and its national interests. And after that, I got to spend about 2 years at the White House as the director for cyber incident response on the National Security Council, which was an incredible experience. It was at a time when there were some really important hacks going on against the United States. And in that role in the National Security Council, it was my job to understand what all government agencies and the private sector were doing on cyber incidents and make sure that information was coalesced and reported up to the West Wing, and sort of train conductor role of making sure we were doing everything we could to keep ourselves and our interests safe. So joining FTI has been an incredible experience to take that type of knowledge and expertise and bring it to a variety of clients who need help. And we work on all types of different incidents as well as preparation type of activities for our clients. So happy to talk to you guys today about these types of threats.
And if, as Jordan mentioned, we will have time for questions. If you can put any questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, that would be helpful. And we will get to them at the end. Jordan, to kick off, talking through your experience at the White House, as we're looking at the Russian-Ukraine war, the government has been releasing alerts talking about increased cyber activity from Russia. We're hearing about Anonymous. We're hearing about all these things back and forth. How are these attacks actually launched? How do we know what's an actual threat? And how prepared do you think we are?
It's a great question, and a couple different angles there that I want to hit on, Megan. I think it's probably been almost 2 to 3 months now that we've been hearing we need to be worried about increased targeting by the Russians. But have we really seen that uptick of activity? So we've been on high alert. The US government put out guidance that they called shields up, and they said we all need to be in a shields up mentality. But what has really changed for us? Not that much. However, we're becoming more highly sensitized to these threats every day. So what is it we need to look for? How do we know if it's real? How long do our shields have to stay up? If we have anyone on the call who's actually in the IT department or a CISO at a company, you recognize that these threats kind of never go away. So your shield might feel like it's always up. But to tell you a little bit about what I worry about the Russians is that they have always been one of our most sophisticated adversaries here in the United States. And we saw in the last 2 years, we've really seen some sophisticated actions that they have done and that they have perpetrated against the US. And it really takes me back to my time in the US government, when we worked on a Russian hack that's called the NotPetya attack. And this was thought to be a ransomware, meaning that they were deploying it on systems and they were asking people to pay a ransom, saying, if you pay this ransom, we'll unlock your files, we'll unencrypt your files. But actually, come to find out, it was not a ransomware, it was a wiper malware. So you could pay the ransom, but there was nothing to unlock because your files had already been erased. So, okay, that sounds like the scary kind of threats that all cybersecurity experts are going to throw at you. But here's where it gets interesting to me. The way that the NotPetya cyber attack began and really perpetrated across the globe was it was targeting of a tax software that was commonly used in Ukraine. So think about that. If TurboTax was the vector by which we were going to attack the United States, how many people have TurboTax? A lot of people. And are you thinking of TurboTax as being, and again, TurboTax is in no way, I'm not saying that they are going to be a victim, but think about it as that modality that you might deploy on your system and you might not think twice about. For example, one I think about all the time is Spotify. I love Spotify for my music. I was home last weekend and put Spotify on my parents' iPads and iPhones, and they love it as well. But what are those utilities we might be putting onto all of our devices that our adversaries are smart enough to say, that's how I'm going to get in? What is the application that you all have on your phones? There might be, we might have to have a couple, but I bet you I could probably name about 10 different applications and we'd probably cover everybody's devices. And so that's what I worry about when it comes to Russia. I worry about those smarter actions that are going after systems that we might not think of. You may have heard about the SolarWinds attack, and SolarWinds is actually a security appliance that many of us use. It's actually an appliance that's meant to guard off adversaries. And it's quite a noisy appliance, is a term we use to say there's going to be a lot of activity and a lot of alerting on that appliance. And because we know it's meant to protect us, many IT departments turn down that noise. They basically say, SolarWinds, that's good. You get an alert from SolarWinds, we can ignore that. But the Russians knew that, and therefore they targeted SolarWinds as a vector to get into these companies. And so that's what I think about. We haven't seen it here in the last 2 or 3 months yet, but to me, that doesn't mean that nothing's happening. It means that this really might be the pre-staging time. This might be when the groundwork is being laid for us to become a victim of a major event, whether it's in a month or 2 months, or it could even be years. That we would even become aware of it, because the longer that these types of events go unnoticed, the more beneficial they are to our adversaries. But to hit on sorry, Megan, go ahead.
Do you think that they're happening and we're being protected against them and it's all is well in the world, or no, you think that it's just being
I think it would be, if you think about the fact that one thing that's really changed since the time I joined the government and until now, is that people really realize cybersecurity is national security. People didn't used to think of being cyber secure as being a critical element of national security. So I'm sure that every day at the company level, at the government level, at the international level, a variety of attacks and events are being thwarted. But I would be personally very surprised if there are not, well, it's just impossible to think that there aren't many systems and utilities that we currently use that have been overtaken by actors, whether they're the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, even the North Koreans, or whether they're by cyber criminal actors. It's just too ubiquitous right now to think that people aren't going after common utilities that we're using every day to try to get either valuable information or bring harm to us. And I worry about it every day.
Now I'm super worried as well, which is why we have you here. So what I mean, the goal in them doing these nation state cyber attacks would be basically, like you were saying, like the ransomware or getting what they.
Yeah. So for every type of attack, we think that the actor groups, based on why it is that they're out there doing what they're doing, that may drive them to have different types of victims. Their outcomes may be different. So as we think about if Russia is coming after us as a nation, who are they likely to target? So they're going to be targeting likely our banks, things that impact our way of life, whether it's healthcare or other critical infrastructure, those types of things that are going to bring a real sense of discomfort to our lives, because that's going to cause us problems. In fact, I mean, I have no reason to believe that this is the case, but someone popped my office this morning and people may be tracking this Supreme Court leak, and they said, did Russia do it to stir up controversy? And so those types of things that will just impair and impact our way of life. I think particularly because of the fact that there is obviously a military conflict right now, I think they will do things to impair but not destroy. So for example, if you think about it in the example of trains on a train track,
Mhm.
I think it could be likely that they would perhaps shut down the train tracks or push people to go in directions that's not what they wanted. But I think it's less likely that they would start some type of action that would cause death and destruction, because there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to cybersecurity conflict in terms of what will be considered escalatory. So what do we think they're going after? Critical infrastructure, things that will impair our technology. We saw right at the beginning of this conflict, there was some targeting of, you all will probably be familiar with Viasat. If you've ever used plain Wi-Fi, the satellite systems that are providing that internet, was it because they were providing internet to Ukraine, or was it because they're providing internet on planes that we all sort of blindly log into and start doing our work on our devices for 1 hour, 2 hours, 10 hours? So I think what is it that they're going after? How will we know what to look for? It's all going to be very dependent on what's important to us as a business. So if I can just go down one rabbit hole and give you an example of how we value a business, this might be different to how an adversary values a business. And it's an overused example, but I think it's truly the best one. When Marriott acquired Starwood, they acquired Starwood to have additional properties and additional guest lists. There was a truly commercial value in that decision. And so when it was determined that several years before the acquisition, Starwood had actually had a security issue that adversaries were able to take advantage of after the acquisition, that issue was not patched. And so they were actually able to get incredibly valuable information about people who were staying at now Marriott owned properties, including passport information. And so why do we think that was being hacked? Was it another hotel chain that wanted to benefit from that and maybe send their flyers to those people? No, it was believed and is known to be the Chinese. And why would the Chinese want to know where people are staying and what's going on? There's a lot of reasons behind that. It's similar probably to some of the reasons why they're making big investments in 23andMe and other DNA companies. But perhaps they happen to know that there are people traveling under CIA cover within country. Are they traveling under a true name? Are they able to determine passport numbers of other members who might be in touch with those folks that are staying in the hotels at the same time? What national security interests were actually put in true jeopardy because of the hack of Starwood? And so that's a very extreme example, but what you think your business is valuable for is very unlikely to be exactly the same as what an adversary thinks. So we all have to kind of shift our thinking caps and say, why might they want to target me? And it might not be what we think we're good at or what we think is valuable about us.
And I mean, this maybe seem like a basic question, but with the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, do you think that the threat is just steady anyway? This is what you look at, or is the conflict going to predicate additional threats or fast forward?
There's a lot of debate out there on that very topic. In fact, there was so much threat information that came out in February where they said, get ready, it's coming. Nothing's happened. There are a lot of theories about why that is. Have they taken their criminals offline to have them staging for a bigger national security purpose? Are they having all of them do that kind of pre-implantation activity that I was talking about earlier? Maybe they are keeping hands off keyboards because they don't want to escalate. Now, I don't find that theory incredibly likely, but there could be a lot of reasons why what's happening with Ukraine and Russia could change the state of what's going on. But it's not as though Russia is our only cyber adversary. And so we have all other types of cyber adversaries who are constantly coming at us and attacking us every day. So how much the conflict is changing the state of affairs, I think remains fairly unknown right now. And many of us are having long and probably boring conversations speculating about what really will happen. But there are still a lot of unknowns. And I think the truth is, and I'll reiterate the point I said at the beginning, for those of us that are in this industry, in this field, we feel a bit like our shields are always up. So it hasn't gotten worse, but it certainly hasn't gotten better.
Okay, now so the next step, if we're talking about the sanctions against Russia, is that going to push them further, or it's the same debate? We just,
it's the same conversation that me and my incredibly nerdy friends have together. I think that it is possible that some of the sanctions behaviors will drive additional behaviors on behalf of the adversaries, in terms of, do they feel like the wrong things are being targeted? Do they feel like some of the sanctions behaviors are unfair? We have wondered about the SWIFT banking system and some of the actions that they've taken. So while we haven't actually seen a cause and effect yet, like this was sanctioned and thus this happened, I think it's certainly true that targeting of the industries that we anticipate will have issues is up. And we need to just be highly sensitized to the fact that the consequences and the way we think about consequences might not be the same as our adversaries. So I can't really stress enough that the way we think about things, I won't be a victim because this has nothing to do with me, doesn't mean that's not going to be in the realm of the possible.
Right. So, talking about, if we're looking, you're talking about the SWIFT bank system. So I know that there were cybersecurity experts did a live fire exercise to simulate a cyber attack and assess defenses. Can you kind of talk through that was for NATO members? Can you talk through what they did, and should US businesses do that? Could talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So these types of simulated cyber attacks are something that probably many of you have actually undergone something like this at your business at a different level of sophistication, perhaps, but who knows, it might have actually been at a higher level. And we call them all different types of things, where it's a cyber incident response simulation, a live fire exercise, a tabletop exercise. These are things that are designed to truly stress test the types of protocols that we have in place. I tell people all the time when they say, I don't need to do that because we know exactly what we would do. There's a couple of fun questions I love to ask people. I love to say, if we had to make a decision as a business, whether or not we were going to pay the ransom, whose decision would it be? And it's just one of my favorite moments when 5 or 6 different hands go up in the room. And it's clear to me that that decision has not really fully been vetted across the team, and people aren't clear who would have what decision-making role. Same for, I love to ask a question in a simulation of, if all of our networks went down, what would be the first thing you would do? People say, I would call A, B, or C. And then we say, how would you get their number? And they say, well, I'd get it from my computer. And so that question of what do you have accessible offline? So this live fire exercise, as I understand it, was, as much as it might sound, corny is not quite the word I'm looking for, but it might sound a little crazy that we have very high level officials sitting at a table and essentially doing a role-playing exercise. I cannot underscore the significance enough of how invaluable something like that is, because in the moment of the heat of the moment, and in the fog of war, as they say, to be able to say, if this happens, I know exactly what I'm going to do, because we've already talked about it. We've talked about the pros and cons. I know who I'm going to call. And often in these types of live fire simulations, they'll introduce a variety of variables that are somewhat unpredicted. So perhaps it's always Megan's decision to whether we're going to do A or B, and Megan is completely unavailable. So they force decision-making testing to say, well, if Megan's not available, who do we call? What happens next? And I know some organizations do these annually, some of them do them quarterly, some of them maybe not as frequently, but those who do, and I know sometimes there's a little bit of a barrier to entry to have the first one because it just feels so foreign, they make such a huge difference in their ability to truly respond. So I commend NATO for conducting this exercise, because I am confident that all that it has done is really improve our ability to respond in the case of a live event.
And if we take that down from like the NATO level to what company, I mean, if I'm an investor, if I'm a client, like many of those on this call, what should we be asking our institution? I mean, we shouldn't assume that they're doing this, right? We should be asking our institutions, are they taking these kind of precautions?
Absolutely. Everyone, I think there's been, and I may be shifting a little bit, and I wouldn't be the best person to know this, but I think there's always been a little bit of hesitation to ask too many questions about cybersecurity. I don't want to sound stupid, so I don't want to ask, I have questions about it, but I don't want to push back. And I also think there's been a sense somewhat from those of us in the cybersecurity community to kind of go, we got it. Don't ask us. don't, it's under control. Don't ask me about our multi-factor authentication. You don't know what you're talking about. And I think some of those walls are coming down. So I don't think asking about just purely, do we do tabletop exercises, and you get the answer of yes, then you can say, well, great, we're ready to go. But I think there are a couple of questions that I think all business leaders should familiarize themselves with a little bit of comfort to be able to ask questions about them. So whether it's, hey, do we ever test what we would do if ransomware happens? Or, hey, what is our protocol for, might be multi-factor authentication is a good one to ask about, and particularly in light of the New York Department of Financial Services regulations and some other actions that are probably pending from the SEC. People need to know more about their cybersecurity and increase their comfort. There's lots of different ways to get there, but a couple of benchmarking type questions that they're going to ask throughout the year, one of which might be, how often do we do tabletops and what do we cover in those, could really increase your comfort.
Let me ask, we've got a couple of questions coming in, and some of them are a little bit more on the granular level, which would be, I think, helpful as we go up and down here. So one is just talking simply about, what should we be using in our home to guard against? So somebody said their internet service provider sent something called Active Armor. Is that a good one? A computer came with ESET. Do you need more than that? So what kind of stuff on your home computer, and should you be having, and do you need an expert to be able to put it in? My expert is my 18-year-old, but do you need somebody besides that? And
yeah. Well, so I think the truth is, obviously we can be victims as personal home computer users. It's not to say that we aren't, but that's not necessarily the same type of targeting that your company or business is going to have. So it's a bit of a broad stroke, but if everybody will forgive me, if you buy a laptop that's pre-installed with an operating system that does have a baseline of security, whether it's an endpoint detection and antivirus software, for the most part, that's going to be adequate for your home computing. But what's going to matter is the behaviors that you actually display on that system. So do you exercise care in the types of websites that you visit? Do you have multi-factor authentication turned on all of your email services? How often are you checking that machine for updates? If you're getting a note that says this needs to be updated and you're saying delay, I'll do it in a month. Those updates are almost always because something has been discovered that's a vulnerability that they are trying to close and patch for you, right? So I think that that concept of just exercising some good behaviors is probably a best practice for home. That's not to say that we aren't going to fall victim to something. If you do exactly what I say, there's still some risk, but you're more likely to fall victim to something like a fraud that's not actually on your computer, meaning someone emails you and says, I have these files. They likely don't have those files for the most part in the home computer sense. But I can't say this enough times. I probably have already used that phrase. Go home, or maybe you're all home now, and turn on multi-factor authentication on all of your email services. If you're using Gmail, have multi-factor authentication turned on. My Gmail is set up in such a way that I have every time someone logs in from a new IP address, I get an alert of that. And it's usually me, which is great news. But that's the kind of thing, the functionalities that we have built into these services that we use so often, you should be taking advantage of those. And if you are a email or other webmail based user and you are not using multi-factor authentication, please go do that today.
And it's interesting. I would take the tabletop exercise that you were talking about, like having that prep, who's going to make that decision. I'm going to bring it down again to a client investor level and say, have it with your family, right? As well. Like talk to, I mean, in my case, talk to my parents to be able to say like this, explaining some of that to be able to get ahead of it, right?
Yeah. And, thinking about how we're using our systems, and this is the least sophisticated and savvy type of cyber event, but it is causing businesses to lose millions of dollars. It's something we call business email compromise. Mm-hmm. And just to give you a really quick version of it, if you haven't heard of business email compromise, someone typically in your accounts receivable department, they either actually get hacked or they get an email from something that looks very legitimate. It's usually one letter different in a domain name. And it says, hey, you owe us a bill, but we've changed our payment wiring information. And they say, sounds great. And they send the wire to the new place. So sometimes it doesn't involve anything on actually getting into your accounts at all. It just involves people falling victim to these schemes. But a critical part of why those are often successful is because of the fact that they are using information that looks very legitimate. So let's say, for example, you say, it was a great weekend at this conference I attended, or I'm headed out to this conference, I'm going to be gone for a week. That makes you potentially a victim of someone who could find you on LinkedIn, find who's in your accounts receivable department and say, hey, it's Megan, I'm out of town, as you know, I need you to make this change. And that is the type of information that we're putting out there. Now, people often, I'll talk to people and they'll say, oh, you must have no social media and you probably don't even use a cell phone. You can't, in my view, you can't live your life that way. You got to live your life with some good parameters around things. But every piece of information you put out there, whether it's you, your spouse, your parents, anyone in your family, those are pieces of information that bad guys are using to potentially target you and your company. So if your kid is a big sharer of information, you know, we've seen instances where kids had posted pictures of mom's laptop with a post-it note up top with the password, right? I mean, is that, I would never even think to remind you of that, but the kinds of things that you just have to always be thinking and always vigilant.
So here's a vigilant question. I back up every night. Does that help if attacked by ransomware, or am I locked out of being able to recover anything?
Backups are great. I mean, we should probably talk more about business continuity, about what the plan will be to be able to get into what you're doing. If you're backing up for home purposes, that certainly is great. I will say this about businesses. Many businesses don't back up every day. It's just not fiscally responsible, timing responsible. So you should, and I hate to say, everyone should understand their backup strategies, because that's probably a little bit of a bridge too far. But if you were to say, we've been hit by ransomware, we're going to need to recover to a previous point, how far would that be for your company and how long would it take? That's such an interesting concept to me, is that I'll talk to particularly CEOs of businesses and they'll say, I'm not worried about ransomware because we back up very regularly and we're just going to restore. And at the end of the day, sometimes a full restoration, we're not talking 24 hours. We can be talking weeks, if not more, depending on the volume of data that you have. So it's always great to back up. I couldn't agree with that more. At the same time, sometimes when an attack is deployed, whatever actually laid the groundwork for that attack, often called a Trojan, is previous to that. So it's really important if you say, yeah, great, no problem, we've restored to our backups, you may not be in a situation when you're actually remediated. So it's really important to still conduct a full investigation, still understand how this type of thing happened, and not just say, yeah, we backed up, we're good.
Is there a threat to, this is what I worry about, is there a threat to investment portfolio values and bank accounts? Can accounts get drained? Should I go get all of my $7 and put it in my mattress?
So it's so interesting you say that. Many of you probably have already seen or know that the FBI put out some specific information about threat actors targeting the financial space, particularly on the investment side. Also, particularly in the mergers and acquisition space, that they were looking for news of potential acquisitions. They're getting onto systems and actually searching for keywords that one might find if a business is in the process of being acquired, and using that information against that business to say, we're going to go public with this, so now you have to pay us this ransom. The truth is that all financial accounts are potentially at risk. Now, that's not to say, there is obviously a great deal of money lost in cyber attacks. So I don't want to say, your bank account is at risk, is not at risk, but is that really what we're seeing the actors do? I'm not seeing a lot of individual targeting of you or me to say, I'm in your Wells Fargo account now. They also have their own protections. The financial sector has always been, in my mind, somewhat at the tip of the spear when it comes to cybersecurity. They use what we call behavioral heuristics. So they track things as sensitive as how quickly do you type your password when you log into your banking site? And if that changes the next time, if it goes from, to I'm now henpecking it, that's the kind of thing that can trigger additional checks on their end to say, this doesn't seem right. Are we coming in from a new IP? And you might find yourself, and that's happened to me every now and then, I'll get something doesn't seem right. You're locked out now. And that's because of those behavioral heuristics. So are your individual accounts at risk? Not in the same way your entire business is at risk for downtime, loss of financial resources, loss of productivity because you're locked up with ransomware. That's more what I worry about, along with the business email compromise.
And so setting, probably you wouldn't recommend, I mean, you're obviously not a financial advisor, you're a cybersecurity expert, but you don't think we need to set aside large sums of cash in case the US financial infrastructure is attacked?
Oh gosh, I mean, I feel like I mean, it's like a doomsday prepper question. I think you have to figure out your own risk tolerance there. I'm pretty sure my husband probably has more cash than I know, but he's more paranoid than I am about this stuff. So I think I don't think of it that way. I think businesses should think about what their cyber insurance model is, what they would be prepared to pay in the event of a ransom, especially if they didn't have cyber insurance or didn't want to invoke it. But in terms of the financial sector is going to collapse and we're going to need money at this point in the world, I don't know if that's any more likely from a cyber event or anything else. So I won't wait.
Transition to Web 3.0 platforms versus Web 2.0 platforms, does that help with these security concerns?
So there's so many things out there that really, I think, do make a big difference in terms of implementation. But thinking about, I mean, I've heard people say like, oh, is this how we're going to fix it? Right. We're going from IPv4 to IPv6. We're changing what we're using on our phones in terms of what network that we're on. I think that obviously there was a Web 1.0. There are some upgrades that are happening on the back end. We have so many more devices that are trying to connect to the web, our smartphones, all the mobile networks that we have. So I think there will be, in theory, some potentially greater utility out of Web 3.0, but it's not going to be the panacea of we're here now and we're secure.
Yeah.
I don't know if that ever will happen. I'm sorry to say.
Right. So that leaves the next question. How safe are apps like garage door openers, Nest cameras? My oven, I think, might be connected to the internet. Yeah. Unclear. So are those safe, or is that like when you're talking about going into Spotify, is that something that we're like, of course my oven's fine, but no, it's not?
So we call that the Internet of Things, IoT. You may hear that, of all these things that are connected, and each item that is connected to the internet is potentially an access point for an adversary. So if you have to communicate between, whether it's your phone or a home built-in application, that potentially could be a risk. We have done plenty of checks of individuals who want to have their whole home really checked for what are my risks in my home. And maybe they have a theater room and it's got a projector that perhaps isn't connected to the internet, but might just need some software updates that allow it to introduce vulnerabilities. Oh, and then turns out it is connected to the internet. So every one of those additional devices that you have can be a vector for entry. So I don't want to downplay it. And I think people just need to be really aware of what they have and whether they need that to be connected into their home network. There are a lot of secure ways of building a network system where you truly understand all the access points you have in your home. I think obviously any system that has voice recognition that's on all the time, you should be thinking about that. Do you need that? Is it useful to you, and why? And just also remember, many of these devices can change their terms of service relatively easily and change what they're doing. I think about the fact I've always been a little more paranoid probably in the IoT space, and I got a dog camera for Christmas, just exactly what I needed to send treats to the dog when I wasn't there. And I, checked it out, played with its functionality, and all it ever did was, and all it had the capability to do was when I logged into it, that activated the camera, and then you could, terrify the dog remotely. And so that was great. And then one day I got a notification in the application. It said, we've changed our functionality. We now are a motion sensor camera. So you'll get all the best photos of your pet. Well, come to find out, that was also all the photos of every time I had walked by the camera in the last 2 weeks. So it was activating itself. And I mean, look, I had the camera in the house. I knew what the capabilities were. But just to keep in mind that we think we might set something up in a certain way and we're set and we're secure. But these devices, what is it they say? If you can't tell what the product is, you are the product. So why might they want to be capturing more information about me? How can they potentially monetize that? And how can it be used? And then they actually said they had set up a place for me in the cloud to store all of my motion activated videos. And then that's at risk. So an actor being able to get into that space. So, I mean, you're never going to get to a place, I don't think, unless sort of we go back to the dark ages, which, maybe I hope for that some days too. But these devices are just going to increasingly become available with that capability, and people need to understand how they're set up. One of the biggest stumbling blocks of these devices, whether it's mobile video doorbells or other things, even just home cameras, is they're often not set up correctly. So people think of them as being inherently dangerous and risky. It's not usually the case. What's usually the case is they haven't been set up correctly. So this is a situation where you might want to take a little bit of extra care and you not do what I do. You need to actually read the instructions. Don't just throw them to the side. Yeah.
Yeah. Or don't buy it in the first place, because I'm not an instruction reader either. But so somebody said that my bank had me use my voice to say, my voice is my password, please verify me. That seems safe. Do you think that that's safe?
So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about password configuration. I'm anticipating that was probably a second factor on your password. Maybe there was, I don't know, I'm guessing that there were at least two things, because voice is obviously grabbable from some other purpose. And we think about the story of where, I may get this a little bit wrong, so bear with me if you Google it later and see that I was off. But I believe at a big conference in Europe, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, when iPhone went to using the thumb, someone grabbed a picture of Angela Merkel's thumbprint and was able to say, I would be able to unlock her iPhone with this data point. And people think about that all the time with their irises being used for different things. And so you always want to have that concept of multifactor, which is usually something you know and something you have. So your voice is something you have, and the something you know could be an alphanumeric password of some sort. They're not all foolproof, but
the multi-factor, that makes sense. What about systems like Lifelock, which didn't that get hacked, or there's home title lock? Are those, is that a level of protection that people should be able to count on?
So it used to be the case that when people were breached and they were offered credit monitoring or Lifelock services, everybody would sign up. I mean, I don't know when this was, but now when it's offered, I understand the uptake rate of it is just incredibly minuscule. Less than 1% of people opt in to credit monitoring and other services. I don't think there's necessarily one foolproof way out. I'm not a salesperson for any of those services, so I'm sure they would tell you, yes, they are, and this is why, because I think they're probably going to actually provide you monitoring on what I'm about to say, which is you should be aware of your credit score in general. You should find some service that you're comfortable looking at your credit score, whether it's directly through your bank account or one of your investment accounts. And when something changes, it's worth taking a look as to what that is. You should in general have a sense of the number of things that your information is opted into. Take some time to understand where all you're using your home address, how many data points that is creating outside the world. You might be familiar with data brokers. There's probably 6 or 8 data brokers in the world. You can actually, no, there's probably hundreds of data brokers. There's 6 to 8 main data brokers, and you can actually opt out of all of those services. Now you're talking about, for the effects of that to actually be felt, might be something like 2 to 3 years, but that is one way to decrease the footprint and volume of information that is out there about you. I'm actually in the process of moving, and I'm wondering, should I do the PO box and never have anything associated with this address? Because it's almost impossible to do it unless you do it from day one, square one. So you have to figure out what information out there about you, monitor it. I mean, the word I'm thinking is monitor it lightly, but monitor it in some way that you're comfortable with it, and be prepared to take action if things are not as they seem, and understand, what sources of information they might be coming from.
Shutting off the computer, which is something that also doesn't happen in my house. I may be the most at-risk person in the world. Does shutting off the computer in the evening help to reduce the risk of attack? No?
So turning off your computer is one way to force updates on your computer.
Or turning off the network, right? And it's 2 different questions, I guess.
Yeah. So I would say having a healthy relationship with your computer in terms of running updates and regularly restarting the machine is healthy for the device. Yeah. I would not say it's necessarily decreasing the volume of how many attacks you might receive, although I guess theoretically, There are many adversaries that are kind of scanning for everything that's out there. And if you're only online 1 or 2 hours a day, you might decrease your footprint. I don't know that I've ever seen that as a recommended tactic, but I would say, you know, having your machine on all the time, never rebooting, never running for updates, don't do that.
Noted. Noted. Do iPhones have better security than Androids?
Ooh, that's a well debated topic. This is really a next level discussion of what people said for many years, which is that Macs were more secure than PCs. There was a lot of discussion about why that was the case. They obviously think about security differently. They're different brands. But there was also a time when Macs were just so much less common that it was a better game for an adversary to target PCs because the volume was higher. I mean, I'll tell you this. I am sitting in an office next to my boss. He's an Android user. I'm an iPhone user. There are pros and cons to both. I would not say either of them are inherently less secure. It's really about how you use them and if you use their security and their capabilities for good. I will tell you, I did not love when Apple switched to the face unlock. I don't love the face unlock. I feel like it just unlocks and I'm not even looking at it.
Right.
But that there are always going to be different investments that they're going to be making in security, and Android and Apple are two companies that are really up there when it comes to doing things right.
Longer passwords versus shorter ones with a wide variety of types of characters.
So the thinking on this has changed over the last 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years. Obviously, you don't want to use anything that is a word. And there are some websites you'll sign up for that won't let you use a word because that potentially means that you could be the victim of a dictionary attack. But a word versus random characters or configurations of letters isn't necessarily harder to crack if someone's running a tool against your password. So there's a lot to be said for a longer password. A longer password takes longer to crack if someone is running a tool against it. But if you can't remember a longer password, then it's not more secure. And yeah, so that's the thing is that if you're looking at it going, I'm never going to remember that, you need to figure out what are good password behaviors for you. I mean, I feel like no one employs them. I mean, even I, who I'm sitting here telling you about this, I have 1 or 2 that I know are kind of my throwaways. But I do recommend a password manager. I know you'll probably
LastPass or whatever, right?
You'll see articles against them sometime like, oh, they've been hacked or they're not that great. But I think password managers are the key to getting this right. And I typically set my passwords at 32 characters using LastPass.
Wow. Okay. Someone said they froze their credit on the big 3 agencies, Experian, but will that help? That protects you from somebody getting a new credit card, that if you're looking for those kind of services.
It does. It definitely does. It doesn't mean that there won't necessarily be, other ways that your identity can be used, but yeah, that's definitely a good step.
Okay. NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Are you familiar with it? And can you give a brief summary?
Sure. So the NIST CSF, or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, as you just said, and NIST, for those who don't know, I feel like government people are always so bad about using acronyms, is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and it's a subcomponent of the Department of Commerce. And they are the part of the government that has really taken a critical role in defining a baseline or kind of minimum standards of cybersecurity. And the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is one very applicable framework that organizations can map their cybersecurity readiness against. It breaks cybersecurity preparedness into a variety of categories, whether it's business continuity, disaster recovery, identity and access control, different categories of things that you probably need if you're building an information security program. And it has a variety of kind of built-in controls that it'll say, you need to have something along these lines. So often, if organizations don't have a framework that they're following for their organization to test their readiness, we will recommend the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We'll come in and we'll do a mapping between their program and the framework and say, here's a gap, or hey, everything's covered. There's always room for improvement, but it's a great baseline. Okay.
Helpful. So yeah, like sort of benchmarking.
Exactly.
And so in terms of a password manager, going back, use LastPass. Is there one that you think is better?
I use LastPass. If you had my entire team in here, you actually wouldn't get like 70 different answers, but you would get maybe 3 or 4, but LastPass is a reliable one. I think you should always do your due diligence on what is going to work best for you, but I like LastPass.
Okay, this one may be out of your expertise. So talking about cyber attacks on systems that are part of cryptocurrency and NFT investments, aside from not talking about if those investments are advisable or not, but are they safe from a cyber perspective?
So yeah, it's not totally out of my expertise, so I'll do it a little bit. I think that it's a new uncharted space, and many of the businesses that are operating in this space are figuring out their way. If any of you are in New York, which I think probably a good number of you are, there are some specific things that have come out of the DFS about being in this space, some certifications that many have found really hard to reach to be, I don't know if qualified is the right word, but really to be certified as a provider in the cryptocurrency space. I don't think that they're inherently less secure. I think that it's just any burgeoning industry is one that the adversaries are going to try to target. They're going to try to look for ways in as these businesses are getting built up. And that's really the time when people often are victimized, when people are in the process of undergoing great change, investing in their platforms. So I don't think the businesses are inherently more risky or more dangerous. I think that they're just more likely to be targeted right now because there's such a focus on this space.
Okay. Those are, there's one other question, but it's a little bit too investment centric. So I think it's probably one best for an advisor. So what I've learned is when I'm on an airplane, don't go on my laptop. I should just read my book and never do any work. Spotify, they might be coming for me on Spotify. Taylor Swift might have to.
I hope there's no, Spotify investors on here. I think Spotify is a wonderful company. I just use them as an example of what might be if you go back in time and think about if the solitaire game had been one that we'd all downloaded and didn't come automatically with Windows, and someone thought, how can I hack everybody? Right? Solitaire would have been the way to do it. I mean, Wordle. They could have put some sort of active, what we call drive-by malware, which means you just go to the website and you have an issue. If they could have put something like that on the space, what will happen? And I think, I hope hopefully those aren't the takeaways. I'm going to be in so much trouble, but thinking about how now that many people are working from home, are you employing inherently more risky behaviors because you're not thinking about it as I'm at a desk or an office? Do you do things on your phone that you might not ever do on a laptop? Those are the kinds of things that, I hate to say that I want people to always be on high alert, but to just be thinking more often is often really a key to success.
Well, and I think that that's really the key, right? Like, because we're all working at home, and in many ways we have to think as a business, think as a business would, because and like you're saying, you're on the computer a lot more all day from your home, as opposed to being in an office with different levels of protection. So, thanks, Jordan, for scaring us again. Really helpful. Any big takeaway that you want to leave folks with? And in all sincerity, of course, thank you so much for giving us this insight. Big takeaway you want to leave everybody with?
If I already said it, so go turn on your multifactor authentication on your email. Yep. But I think that think the impossible. Think particularly in the business sense. Think about your business, not the way you value it, but the way a bad guy would value it. And if you are in a position to be involved with your information security department, increase your comfort, but do recognize that I've been in this field for a number of years. The folks that do this work are really just carrying the lion's share of these insurmountable threats, it seems sometimes, and they need our help and they need our support, but they also need to be adequately staffed, resourced, funded in order to keep our businesses safe, because sometimes they are, we need them on that wall. And so to be thinking about how you can better understand their mission and help and support their cause would certainly be one thing I'd remind everyone.
All right. I actually have two quick follow-ups. Okay. The answer to the home title lock, you thought that was worth that system.
Home title lock, say that.
Home title lock. Maybe we were just sort of talking about Lifelock.
Yeah, like credit monitoring, freezing makes sense. Yes. Those services are really up to you. I think and I said, do those things do Norton Lifelock? I think, do those things do what you intend them to do? I'm not a user of them, but they probably are doing some of the things I recommended, checking the types of things like your credit and just monitoring your online identity.
And then this is interesting, should you check on your accounts on your home computer or on your cell phone? Is one of them safer?
So the thing that's, I think, a bit safe, well, no, they're not one, there are pros and cons to both. I think the thing that is often safer about our home devices is that there's oftentimes many more functionalities on a website. For example, if you're logging into your Gmail, you can look and see what my last 10 logins were. Those are things you in theory can get to through a mobile browser, but they're not as convenient. But I think the answer is you can be secure in both environments. You just need to make sure you're doing the right things in terms of securing your passwords, accessing safe sites, and looking for those types of best practices that your business is giving you to be sure you're doing the right things.
And I've already got a follow up on your takeaway. How do you check multi-factor authentication? Like I know my Hightower, they pushed it onto my phone. Like if I'm just my kid, how do I put multi-factor on for them?
So it depends on the service you're using it for, right? In Google, you might find that you need to go into your security, do a security checkup in Google. All of the services are going to have it. I mean, it's just going to be a very imperfect answer, but you might have to kind of search service by service. Your laptop might have it. You might have something called a YubiKey, which so you type your password and then your YubiKey is something you touch on the side of your machine to activate. So multi-factor authentication can be employed in a variety of different services. You're just going to have to see what tool you need it for and then how they allow you to use it.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'm going to spend one super fast second putting up disclosure that we have to share. And then I'm going to also use this time to say thank you, Jordan, so very much for being a part of this webcast. I think I learned a ton and I have to go do a bunch of better behavior. Thank you all to everyone that joined us. If we're invited by an advisor, please follow up with your advisor. We're going to be able to send out some of Jordan's tips and things to be able to keep track of. And thanks for being a part of this webcast. So have a good, safe rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.